Down there's a big issue cladding members of Parliament who wish to escape a not deal Brexit. They can't fair shaw down there is a most in the building of House of Commons versus no transactions, they requirement to show down there is a most in favour of an option result. How since outgoing the EU, in or out of a transactions, is now the failure. If the treaty the main secretary has agreed in the EU fails to undergo the building of House of Commons, the UK will keep in no transactions at all except thing changes, since outgoing the EU is spelled in UK Act. The EU Departure Act sets March 29 as the day of leaving. The formulation of the Act does enable a secretary to changing the determination of output date comparatively rapidly with a statute tool, a chunk of second law, quite rather than an completely new Act of Parliament. How would requirement to be discussed? A secretary would include to offer the changing and MPs would include to endorse it. But down there is a other and more than considerable cause why no transactions would be the failure stance, house which EU law says. Paper 50 of the Lisbon Contract is the official path for any nation outgoing the EU, and it allows for a couple-year trial of negotiating. At the end of how time this treaties shall stop to use to the country in issue except Paper 50 is stretched or annulled. The largest evident way thus to halt a not deal Brexit, or any shape of Brexit, is to cancel Paper 50. But it seems very hardly how the building of House of Commons would voice to cancel Paper 50 except down there had been else plebiscite, or perhaps an poll, in that the Social supported the UK left in the EU. By the government waste the concept of keeping else plebiscite in any case, and the period to do so up the end of March has run of. So, the some way to escape a not deal Brexit in the brief period is to act for period and expand the Paper 50 time. By the government would requirement to offer how and MPs would include to endorse it. Yet, critically, in comparison with in the instance of revocation Paper 50, to expand it the UK would as well requirement the treaty of all 27 some EU countries. It would perhaps requirement to convince them how thing essential had modified in UK policy to order an expansion, maybe a looming poll, or else plebiscite, quite rather than more than of the identical reason. One of the current restriction for the otherwise of the EU is how Europe elections will get location at the end of May, and the new Europe Parliament, out of UK MEPs if Brexit has undertaken location, is due to encounter for the at first period in July. The just some term in that a short expansion to Paper 50 would perhaps be adopted by the EU is if down there had been a voice in favour of Theresa May's transactions, but a slight more than period was necessary to dot the IS and crucifix the TS. But if Paper 50 was stretched out of a transactions fleeting the building of House of Commons, no transactions would yet stay the failure result at the end of the stretched negotiations time. In a speech, amendments. The try to correct the financial draft, to hinder the Exchequer conducting cash on not deal preparations out of the obvious agreement of Parliament, will be just the at first of lot. The correction, tabled by a crucifix party team of chairs of Parliament committees consisting the armchair of the Household Sphere Board, Yvette Cooper, does do it stronger for by the government to drifting in no transactions out of Parliament creature capable to straight it, she says. Which we're potential to see above the following pair of months is which several are inviting partisan war by correction in the building of House of Commons. The trading draft is potential to be else goal, it would be necessary in the occasion of no transactions, to try to hold the UK trade on the identical regulation as it has now in the otherwise of the planet. The armchair of the Brexit board, Hilary Benn, has as well tabled in correction to by the government's movement on the EU departure treaty, Theresa May's transactions, himself. His correction waste no transactions generally. The concept over all the Parliament manoeuvring is to show how down there is a precise most in the building of House of Commons versus no transactions. But no of it, undertaken in insulation, will hinder the Paper 50 watch tick off before it stops at the end of March. How's why a increasing quantity of MPs supporting the concept of keeping a episode of indicating votes on various capacity outcomes, to try to discover an option to no transactions how would delight wide, or though adequate, supporting Elder MPs claim how the by the government would be incapable to disregard the policy blood pressure if the will of the building of House of Commons was obviously pronounced on multiple occasions. But policy blood pressure is not the identical as legislative fact. 3 ministers include told openly they would abandon if the by the government prosecuted a not deal policy, time other are mine to conduct the identical stance in individual. A fistful of backbench MPs include told they would abandon the side. The Job and Pensions Secretariat, Succinnic Rudd, is understood to include said office on Tuesday. How story would get a dim type of the by the government if it recognized no transactions, and it would keep the UK a less than secure nation. But if the main secretary did solve to click on independently, it may so be how the just way MPs could halt and not deal Brexit at the recent time would be to voice downward the by the government himself.